Hello, everyone. Good night. We're running a stream kind of late here. I think this might be a record for the latest starting stream we've done. But I hope everyone's having a good night. If you're in the East Coast, it's about to be 12 o'clock now. That's where I'm at right now, so it's getting pretty late. As I was preparing this, I was asking myself constantly, am I too tired to stream? But Eddie was extremely tired this morning. He said he hadn't slept last night and he was having some back pain, and he still powered through and gave us a wonderful stream exposing V shreds and some of the shenanigans that goes on in the fitness community for the sake of profit. But I'm here with my comrade and Midwestern Marx writer, Paul So. What's up, Paul? How's it going?
Doing well, Carlos. Doing well.
So, what's up, the dude? What's up, Pedamillo? What's up, Where? Hope everyone's doing okay. Um, so today we're going to be reacting to this famous debate from 1971 that takes place between Noam Chomsky and Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault, of course, is one of the fathers of postmodernism, a French philosopher. He was, for some time, a student of Louis Althusser. For a very short period of time, he was a member of the Communist Party of France, although some historians say that him being there was kind of something that was done quite opportunistically. Everyone was joining the party at that moment, and there's a lot to be criticized in Foucault, both as a postmodernist philosopher, but also in the sort of relationship he had to like communist or radical politics. The people that really like Foucault like to overemphasize the somewhat positive or radical parts of his history, and then the people that are more honest see it as sort of these moments of careerism that when it's popular he goes at it, when it's not he produces the most conservative and pro neoliberal analysis possible. There's a really good article actually from Gabriel Rockhill in the Philosophical Salon that basically exposes Foucault and all of this. But Paul, what sort of background do you have with Foucault?
So I studied analytic philosophy, so I have very little background in Michel Foucault. I studied philosophy of mind. I studied some political philosophy. I took some bioethics courses. So I mostly stuck, not exclusively for the most part, I mostly stuck to the analytic tradition. That's until I became a Marxist, right? When I became a Marxist, I decided to open my horizon a bit more. And that's when I began to read Althusser, right? And I didn't read too much Althusser, but I read his one of his essays on reproduction, right? How the superstructure reproduces the social relations. I thought that was very profound. Now I know we have criticisms of Althusser, but that particular chapter was very impressive for me when he talks about the ideological apparatus and how he was sort of systematizing Gramsci's view on the distinction between consent and force, right? And how um, Althusser was focusing mostly on the consent part. The superstructure is trying to create consent. So I was deeply impressed with that, and so I read some stuff, but I didn't read that much Foucault. I did took a class with someone like Kevin Anderson, who taught radicalism, and he touched on Foucault, but I don't remember everything from that class. So, but all I know is that Foucault, um, he was sort of a structuralist, right? He was a bit of a structuralist at first, but then he shifted more towards the post-structuralist side. That's when he produced works like, you know, was it History of Madness? Was that it? History of Mad Discipline and Punishment, right? Yeah, like and he was sort of producing sort of like a radical alternative to Marxism. How he was producing a theory of power dynamics, right? The theory of power that's supposedly not based on historical materials, and that's not based on analyzing social relations and class structures, right? Um, so it's very different from Marxism. And another thing I do know is I read the CIA document praising Foucault for introducing this radical so-called left radical alternative to Marxism, because sort of like absorbed a lot of the supporters away from Marxism. I mean, whether or not it was unintentionally, we will never know, but we do know that the CIA found him useful. So I don't really like him very much, but I prefer. I don't like Chomsky very much either, but for some reason I prefer Chomsky. I have a little bias for Chomsky. One time I did interview Chomsky. At one point, I interviewed Chomsky. He was a
Mhm.
really, really nice guy. But anyways, that's all I know of Foucault. So this is actually my first time watching an interview. Not the first time, but the first time watching the full debate between Foucault and Chomsky. Um, so I'll definitely give my full attention to this debate and do the best I can to produce a thoughtful critique. I can't make any promises because I mean, it's relatively late at night here, so my 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 brain is sort of a little foggy, but I'll do my best. I'll certainly do my best.
Yeah, we're going to be watching specifically the section of the debate that's focused on power and justice. Oh, we
Mm,
got a new member. Thank you, Alex, for becoming a new YouTube member. Um, when
nice.
you become a new YouTube member, that means that you get some perks. I believe one of them is joining the Discord. And if you become a $10 member, you get a free ebook copy of the Journal of American Socialist Studies, which is right over here. Uh, and where we, by the way, now that we're doing a reaction video to Foucault and Chomsky, where we interviewed Noam Chomsky and asked him some questions about the left today, class struggle, the fall of empire, and like topics. But hello, Joey. Hello, Jerdelic. And again, hello, Alex. Hello, Cade Grenade. I gotta say, love the picture. I think I said that last time, but love it. What's up, Cobra Commander? Late night Midwestern Marks. Oh yeah. Though now I'm gonna have a harder time teabagging noobs in the Crucible. um, okay, so yeah, I just want to mention again before, if anyone is interested, there's a couple really good articles from our friend Hill Foucault. Uh, okay, is the screen shared now? There's this Foucault fake radical, and
Yep.
then
Yep.
it produced a sort of shitstorm from Foucault scholars. So he wrote a reply, which is Foucault, anti-communism, the global theory, industry critics. Both of those are really, really good. So I recommend you read those. I'm going to actually link them to the chat. Uh, I'm going to link his all of the articles that he's done for Philosophical Salon, so that way you can see both of them there. But um, real great stuff detailing the sort of relationship that Foucault had with reactionary anti-communist politics, the love that the CIA, that MI6, and the State Departments had for Foucault and his form of radicalism, which they found it fully compatible with the existing order. It's part of what's been called the compatible left, the left that is accepted by the existing order because it doesn't actually challenge it. And I think that one of the uh, paradoxes that you'll see during the debate, if I recall correctly, I haven't seen it in a few years, is something that's central to Foucault and to his strand of thought, which is the idea that discourse is never able to escape the bounds, the social bounds it is constructed in, and that any form of discussion about a post capitalist order, an order that goes beyond the existing order, is bound to be done within the limits of the language of the existing order, and therefore that, the task of devising political projects that go beyond the ones that we have now are from that framework. They seem kind of impossible, and it's a very pessimistic
How
outlook.
did
That
the French Revolution occur then?
right,
Like feudal, like it was happening in the context of feudalism. Like how did late feudalism produce Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau, Hume, and Locke? It just seems puzzling. Like if Foucault is correct, then within the existing order of feudalism, late feudalism that is, like very late feudalism, the discourse, right, can't transcend feudalism, but clearly to some extent it did. We had the
Right.
French Revolution, and we had Napoleon. I mean, he had all his faults, but that's the purity fetish thing. Like, of course, he was flawed, but he spread liberalism, and that was progressive at the time, right? Also, we had also within the United States, we had the slave society, right? There's an abolitionist discourse within the slave society, even and it had some effect. It had substantial effect, right? We had the radical Republicans, right, who were pushing for the abolition of slavery, and you had John Brown, who tried to start an insurrection against slavery. It wasn't super successful, but some people argue that sparked the Civil War eventually, right? And the Civil War, with the backing of the industrialists, right, and others, they successfully abolished slavery towards the end. Now, maybe that wasn't the original intention. The original intention was to preserve the Union, but that intention went through a qualitative shift, right, towards the intention to abolish slavery, right? So I don't know. Like, I'm not a Foucault scholar, but if the claim is correct, I mean, if that's Foucault's claim, I find that puzzling. Like, how can Foucault explain the French Revolution, which took place in the context of late feudalism, and abolitionism and the Civil War, which took place in the context of a capitalistic slave society, right? A slave society with some capitalistic characteristics.
Yeah, absolutely. It's well, I think his argument is can be better formulated by him than
Yeah, yeah,
I
no, I understand.
formulated it. But um, yeah, I'll save my critique for
All
when
right.
we listen to him give it. But yes, very based John Brown, and hello Sam Dixon. Two streams in one day. Yes. Well, I was gonna stream with Eddie earlier, and we are gonna react to this, but I don't know if you guys know, but I'm in the middle of a moving process, which has taken all of my energies for the last almost 2 weeks, and probably will for the next few days. So um, it's I wasn't able to stream earlier, but I was able to pull some energy through last minute. It's basically midnight where I'm at, and decide to stream. And thankfully, Paul
Mhm.
was available. But let's we can get started then with the stream. If at any moment you want to pause it, make some signal, and I can pause it. But and also let me know in the chat if you can hear the stream. But uh,
Well, let me begin by referring to something that I've already discussed. That is, if it is correct, as I believe it is, that a fundamental element of human nature is the need for creative work, for creative inquiry, uh, for free creation without the arbitrary limiting effects of coercive institutions, then, of course, it will follow that a decent society should maximize the possibilities for this fundamental human characteristic to be realized. That means trying to overcome the elements of repression and oppression and destruction and coercion that exist in any existing society, ours, for example, as a historical residue. Now, a federated, decentralized system of free associations incorporating economic as well as social institutions would be what I refer to as anarcho-syndicalism. And it seems to me that it is the appropriate form of social organization for an advanced technological society in which human beings do not have to be forced into the position of tools, of cogs in a machine, in which the creative urge, that I think is intrinsic to human nature, will in fact be able to realize itself in whatever way it will. I don't know all the ways in which it will.
Je suis dans ma démarche.
okay, we could pause it there and maybe discuss a little bit Chomsky's points. Um, I think that the most striking thing from the start is the discourse on human nature. I start to shrivel when I hear human nature as a Marxist, just because the way that we think about human nature is not as this like static thing. Philosophy, the history of Western thought in general, really the way that the question of human nature is always postulated is, in the same way as every question that's related to something universal is, what are the essential characteristics which stay the same throughout space and time? And when you look for those characteristics, what you find is that, you know nothing ever stays the same, nothing ever appears in the same form throughout space and time. And that way of thinking about universals, and in this case the universal of human nature as a universal concept, is what the dialectical tradition would call an abstract or empty universal. It's devoid of content, because the content that's supposed to take form is not considered in the various forms in which it takes, and the various forms it necessarily takes as it's developing in history. So for the Marxists, the question of human nature ends up always being a historically constituted one. It's, what's the nature of human beings in this context, and what's the nature of human beings in this context, and even how we ask ourselves that question and how we approach responding it is going to always be determined by the context in which we're in. So for the Marxists, there's, the closest thing you can give to a general characteristic, to a universal characteristic for human nature, is labor. Labor is the only thing that humanity has always had to do. And, you find in Engels statements such as labor literally created the human, in essays such as The Part Played by Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man. He is going to go on to say that labor made human beings, because it was the hand that first labored, and then the hand developed the brain, and then the brain helped us stand up, or we first stood up and then we developed the brain, and that eventually developed into communication, and into some form of more advanced social relation that other animals didn't have, and eventually that created the human. And leading anthropologists and evolutionary theorists such as Stephen Jay Gould, and who was, I think, from Harvard, if I recall correctly, and a few others have said that, had evolutionary theorists listened to Engels and his dialectical materialist approach, we would have been a century ahead in our studies of the development of human beings, because really labor is the foundation. Now, there's no such thing as labor in general, right? There's always a specific form of labor that's determined by the type of society that people are in, which is, of course, determined by the forces of production, the tools that we have to produce, and the relations through which we produce those, which in Marxism are called the relations of production. And that is, in a way, a creative act. The young Marx said that part of what he called the species being, which is a term borrowed from Feuerbach, is this ability to work creatively, socially, to imbue on nature, to objectify oneself on nature in a creative fashion that's also aesthetic, that produces beauty, that's not just work for its own sake, but not just work for the sake of surviving, but work for its own sake, as something that's fruitful, innately human, and that participates in a certain form of truth that's related to beauty. So, but I've been sort of ranting. So, what are your thoughts, Paul?
No, I 100% agree with you, Carlos. I 100% agree with you. I think the dialectical approach isn't just looking at the universal, which is what someone like Chomsky does. You just look at the universal, but it's also to look at the dialectics or the unity of opposites between the universal and the particular, right? The universal would be, obviously labor, right? The universal is labor, collective labor, not just collective labor, but also like the relationship between collective labor and nature, right? Marx talks about in A Strange Labor, I believe, Marx talks about how nature is the inorganic body of the human being, right? And the reason why he emphasizes this is that we need nature to transform its parts, right, into social products, into the social products that we need to consume to develop, to grow as a society, right? So that we could, reproduce our social existence, right? I think on the Jewish question, I've been reading a lot of early Marxists. I'm taking an independent study with a professor who wants to read on someone Marx. I was reading on the Jewish question, and one of the things I find surprising is that I see a hint of Aristotle and Rousseau in Marx, where Marx emphasizes that one of the criticisms he made of liberalism is that in the level of civil society, liberalism sees people as private individuals with private ends that they pursue, right? And liberty is conceptualized as protecting people's right to liberty from each other, right? But when you see people that way, you see them as atomistic beings, right? Who need to be kept separate in some way, right? Because you don't want them to interfere with one another, right? So in a sense, people aren't seen as being related to one another in some substantial way. They're seen as being atomized with one another. The reason why Marx criticizes that is that it leads to an estrangement from our species being, right? And our species being is being part of some kind of community, a political community, right? Where we sort of make decisions together, right? And he sort of mentions Rousseau's idea of abstract citizen. He talks about how liberalism sort of detaches the abstract citizen from individuals, and he thinks that in a real human world, we absorb the abstract citizen into our everyday lives, and we become immersed in our political community, right? Obviously, a little later in Estranged Labor, he talks about like how the fundamental root of civil society is labor, right? It's labor, but under capitalism, maybe feudalism, labor is estranged from us in some way, right? Depending on. So I basically agree with you. I 100% agree with you. I just think that people there are people who just focus on the universal side. They don't look at how the universal, they ignore the wealth of the particulars, right? Like how universal manifests itself through the particulars, right? So in the context of feudal Europe, it manifests itself in a certain way. In the context of a slave society, Roman ancient slave society, it manifests itself another way, right? In the context of capitalism, it manifests itself as the selling of one's labor, right? To a class that barely does any labor, at least relative to the wage workers. So yeah, I mean, the only thing about that Chomsky said I do agree is creative work, but like he's not very clear exactly on what creative work is, right? Is this something that takes place on an individual level, or is this a social, phenomenon, right? Chomsky tends to make reference to Humboldt, right? As an example of what he means by creative labor. But the way Humboldt talks about creative labor is still very individualistic. He still sees creative labor at an individual level. He doesn't see it at a social level, at a level of society, how society is creative, right?
And also that creativity, like how creativity is expressed, is also dependent very much on society. So like what's considered creative today is different than what was considered creative under feudal society. It's different
Right.
than what's considered creative under certain forms of socialist society that have had different civilizations, right? So creativity itself, which is it's conjoined as one of the central properties of labor, is itself socially determined, right?
Yeah.
As is beauty, as is all of these things.
100% agree with that. It's like it also depends on what challenges you face, but what challenges you face is dependent on the development of the productive forces, right? So what the challenges that feudalism faces is very different from what we face, right? So what the kind of creativity you need to solve those problems, right, is quite different from what we need to do to solve our problems. So I 100% agree with you. Yeah.
Okay, so let's keep going with the video then.
In whatever way it will, I don't know all the ways in which it will.
Je suis dans ma démarche beaucoup moins avancée, je vais beaucoup moins loin que M. Chomsky, c'est-à-dire que j'avoue n'être pas capable de définir, il n'y a plus forte raison de proposer un modèle de fonctionnement social idéal pour notre société scientifique ou technologique. En revanche, une des tâches qui me paraît urgente, immédiate, avant même toute autre chose, c'est celle-ci. On a l'habitude, du moins dans notre société européenne, de considérer que le pouvoir, il est localisé entre les mains du gouvernement et il s'exerce par un certain nombre d'institutions bien particulières qui sont l'administration, en France on appelle ça préfectorale, enfin, je ne sais pas comment on dit ailleurs, l'administration, la police, l'armée. On sait que toutes ces institutions-là sont faites pour transmettre les ordres, les faire appliquer et punir les gens qui n'obéissent pas. Mais je crois que le pouvoir politique, il s'exerce encore, il s'exerce en outre, de plus, par l'intermédiaire d'un certain nombre d'institutions qui ont l'air comme ça de n'avoir rien de commun avec le pouvoir politique, qui ont l'air d'en être indépendantes et qui ne le sont pas. On sait bien que l'université, d'une façon générale, tout le système scolaire, qui en apparence est fait simplement pour distribuer le savoir, on sait que cet appareil scolaire est fait pour maintenir au pouvoir une certaine classe sociale et exclure des instruments du pouvoir toute une autre classe sociale. Quelque chose comme la psychiatrie, qui en apparence aussi n'est destinée qu'au bien de l'humanité et à la connaissance des psychiatres, la psychiatrie est encore une certaine manière de faire peser un pouvoir politique sur un groupe social. La justice également. Bon, et il me semble que la tâche politique actuelle dans une société comme la nôtre, c'est de critiquer le jeu des institutions apparemment les plus neutres et les plus indépendantes, de les critiquer, de l'attaquer de telle manière que la violence politique qui s'exerçait obscurément en eux surgisse et pour qu'on puisse lutter contre elle. À vouloir tout de suite, enfin si on cherche tout de suite à donner le profil et la formule de la société future sans avoir
Oh, I was muted. I think we can maybe stop there because there's a lot to be said there. Yeah, I agree. Foucault's a reactionary and a bad person. Actually, it recently came out that he had paid a poor kid in. Gosh, do you remember where it was, Paul?
I don't remember. I think Gabriel Rocco mentioned it at one point.
Yeah, he had paid a kid to like have sex with him. So it's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
real piece of shit.
yeah.
And I do agree that part of his work, especially some of his work on sexuality, might just be trying to excuse some of the inclinations he had, specifically towards children, which is fucked. But yeah, a lot to unpack there. Paul, do you want to go first? I went first last time.
It's really bizarre because he's like, without acknowledging it, he's taking this like Marxist Leninist line of reasoning towards the superstructure, right? He mentions social class. It's one social class exercising power over another social class. That's literally like straight from Marx and Engels and Lenin's book State and Revolution. It's really weird. He doesn't even acknowledge it, right? And like, but instead of talking about this just the state, he talks about the non-state institutions like psychiatry, right? He talks about how psychiatry is really one class. He doesn't say the bourgeoisie, but one class exercising power over the other class, namely the working class, right? I mean, he doesn't say it, but like that's the subtext there. So it's like it's really weird that he's sort of using this Marxian, like I guess quasi-Marxian language to sort of give a critique of power, but he doesn't really acknowledge that where this line of critique really comes from. It comes from Marx and Engels, right? And to some extent Lenin in State and Revolution. But oh, that's what I see. Maybe I'm missing something there. What do you think, Carlos?
Yeah, it's interesting because so far, like I've had I've had disagreements with Chomsky's somewhat essentializing language, but I'm okay with the sort of characteristics that he denominated with like human nature, creative work. Yeah, it gets a somewhat of a pass, but just that language of human nature I wouldn't use. And then with Foucault, I think that his questioning of Chomsky is it's not bad. He starts by somewhat snarkily telling him like you're much more advanced than I am. You got the whole future society planned out. I can't even get there yet. And in some ways, that could be seen as a critique of a certain form of utopianism, right? Which Marx himself was inclined to do. He was very adamant about not like laying a blueprint for the future and all that stuff. But that's Marx writing at times before the Paris Commune. After the Paris Commune, it changes a little bit. He has some ideas of what a post-capitalist society could look like, what the dictatorship of the proletariat could look like. But this is a debate taking place in 1971. Like
Oh,
we've
wow.
seen the Bolshevik Revolution, obviously the Paris Commune, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Korean Revolution, the Cuban Revolution. Um, at this point, I believe we already saw like the success of Allende in Chile. That falls in 73, but around this time he's getting into power. We've seen so many revolutions that have actually established new orders. China, and to speak about like we don't know what the next world looks like. It just kind of spits in the face of the people that have been actively constructing, a post-capitalist world. But his the points that he makes about the necessity of critiquing uh, first the way that power is thought. So he's right. Power is usually conceived of in the most repressive sense, like it's the military apparatus, the what in the Leninist tradition we call the armed, but the special bodies of armed men. The police, the military. It's the government just using power, and it's a very top-down thing that's thought about. But what he's calling a critique of the neutral institutions through which power also expresses itself is really just the argument that in ideology, in the ideological realm and the institutions, what you mentioned Althusser earlier, what he would call the ideological state apparatuses, what Gramsci would call the institutions that are primarily premised on consent, um, and that uphold the hegemony of the ruling class. He's calling that power as well. So there really isn't much new in his analysis. It's just labeling a phenomenon that Marxists, as you said, have been talking about for a very long time, which is that ideology and the institutions through which they're primarily it's primarily disseminated are not neutral. Like those are institutions which uphold a series of ideas that allow the existing order to propel itself, and that condemn a whole host of other ideas which represent a different class, and if they came to fruition, would challenge ideologically the existing order. Right. So the paradox is that Foucault is is par excellence the example of the ideology that's accepted in academia, and he would become that after his death, although he was becoming a big deal while he was still alive. But it's a very basic point that the ruling ideas in each society are the ideas of the ruling class. All he's saying is that that's a form of power too, and yeah, sure, but I think that there's another good point coming up, but I wanted to pause it before he got to it because I think that we can break those points
I,
up.
I I have a question.
Mhm.
Um, so, what exactly is the disagreement between Chomsky and Foucault so far? Because to me, it seems like to me, the dialectics of this debate looks like this. Chomsky gives his view of human nature. His view is that it's creative work, right? And he thinks that the a kind of society that's best suited for human nature is free association, this sort of like anarcho-syndicalist society, right? but Foucault comes in and says, "Well, Chomsky, like I'm not like you." He gives us like Socratic he shows Socratic humility,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. But then later he's like he gives his picture of how society, how power works, how society works, right? So how does his view, his critique of of prima facie neutral institutions, right, and how power really works, how does that conflict with Chomsky's view of human nature? Like, what's the disagreement there exactly?
Well, I
Like,
don't. It doesn't conflict with Chomsky, and he's going to say that he's. I mean, he's Foucault's talking to the guy that wrote Manufacturing Consent. Like,
right.
along with Parenti's Inventing Reality, it's one of the best books on media criticism. So, I mean, Chomsky knows that the media, that education, that the churches, that all these institutions which appear neutral, that in reality they're there to uphold a certain series of ideas that allows the existing order to reproduce itself. And in old, somewhat mechanistic Marxist jargon, it's the idea that really the superstructure exists in order to reinforce and allow the economic base to continuously reproduce itself, right? And it works both ways in a more dialectical fashion, but the ideas are there because they're conditioned by the existing order, and they help to reciprocally reinforce and allow that dominant order to reproduce itself. So I don't
it's
think there's a disagreement
okay,
yet.
okay.
Maybe in his, I don't think Foucault's willing to talk about human nature in the
Okay.
same way that Chomsky is, and I think Chomsky's more willing to talk about what a post-capitalist society could be. And
Hmm.
I I I I think that there's parts of each and how they formulate the idea of a post-capitalist society, or how they approach that question. I think there's parts of each which are that Marxists can sympathize with, but we'll leave that question for the next section of the video, which is I think when they begin to address that question. But Foucault
Well,
seems to be very much grounded in like the Gramsci Althusser line of,
yeah.
but in a worse fashion.
Yeah.
It's like it's backwards. Like the champ would be Gramsci, Althusser, and then Foucault. If you look at the three.
Right. How much, so like, I mean, I don't read much Foucault, but does Foucault ever publicly acknowledge that at least some of his ideas were influenced by Marx through Gramsci and Althusser? Because the critique he just laid out, right, is simply just an extension of a Marxist and Leninist critique of the state to the superstructure, right? Like, and it's not deeply original because Marx already like made the similar critique in German ideology, right? So it's like I'm wondering, like, does he ever acknowledge where some of his thoughts came from, or does he like pretend that it's his own ideas? That's just one thing I'm more wondering about. I'm wondering if you know an answer to that.
Yeah, so Foucault was very opportunist. So like I mentioned at the beginning, for a brief period of time, and he was in the Communist Party of France when it was popular. When it stopped being popular, he left the Communist Party of France and started, calling himself a Maoist. Right, he was big in the French Maoist movement, along with other people like Deleuze and stuff. And at in the moment where neoliberalism really started taking off, and it was positing itself as this ideology of like of non-state intervention and all this bullshit, which we know it never was. Like, you can say that neoliberalism starts in Chile, and how does it start? With a coup, a
Yeah,
CIA-funded coup that forces Chile to go from the route of socialism that it had to this free market, austerity, privatization, deregulation, liberalization route that's taken, where they literally ship out. Milton Friedman to direct Chile's economy under the dictatorship that existed there, and it just kind of goes to shit, and a bunch of people are killed, and that's just done over and over and over and over again. But Foucault was supported that neoliberal turn because it fit perfectly with his with the ideology that he had developed into, and this whole movement towards what John Bellamy Foster, using Lukács, calls a new irrationalism in bourgeois philosophy that's embodied in postmodernism, post-Marxism, post-structuralism, really all the posts, except for Post Malone. Shout out to Post Malone. But
Oh,
this new ideology is, fundamentally in line in terms of worldview with the late stage of capitalist imperialism that's taken place really since the 70s.
right. I guess another question I have is, I'm asking all these questions about Foucault because you seem to know more about Foucault than I do, because I came from the analytic tradition, right? And then just recently expanding towards the Marxist tradition, I guess to some extent continental philosophy. But I guess one question I have is this: he wrote a book on discipline and punishment, right? Is that analogous to, does that run in parallel with Gramsci's distinction between coercion and consent?
Um, I haven't read Discipline and Punishment in years, but
Because like
I
yeah,
don't.
because like based on what like the rough summary I've read of Foucault's discipline and punishment is like, for Foucault, but the punishment side comes from the state, right? The state exercises coercion to punish people, right? But discipline happens at the superstructural side. It happens in schools, right? It happens like, so like if children are act, in a way that's that would be considered insubordinate, teachers would discipline children, right? Or if at the church, if you act out of hand, the church would discipline you, right? If you violate some social norms, right? The society won't necessarily put you in jail, but there's going to be some kind of discipline, right? And and I guess it's the I guess in every society they have their own version of canceling people, right? So that's one form of discipline. So it's like, I don't know, like I can't help but think that,
Well,
like,
the idea in that book is that you have this shift in how punishment takes place, that at the surface level is less crude and less sanguine, but
right.
at the substance of it is much more nefarious because the punishment is much more internalized. So he starts that book out by talking about how punishment was kind of like a carnival where people were being ripped open by the state for offending the king, and it was a spectacle that people would go see, right?
Mhm.
And that this form of punishment uh, would be replaced by a different form of punishment. He talks for a little while about Bentham's panopticon, which was a sort of jail where you didn't see the people next to you, and you never could tell whether or not the guard was looking at you or not. So you start to self-police your activities as if you were constantly being observed. And he describes that shift in punishment, the putting of the punishment in these geographical areas that are inaccessible to the everyday public. That transition, although it appears at the surface level to be towards a more humane and more progressive form of dealing with criminals, is he will argue, much more, in reality, much more nefarious, much more controlling, because it's not just the state directly controlling you, but it gets to a point where you end up controlling yourself. And in a way, that's you can argue that some of that is already in Gramsci, because Gramsci makes his argument. It's part of how he explains why it was that revolutions didn't erupt in Europe but did in Russia, which is that after the failure of the 1848 revolutions in Europe, the state that ended up developing was much more integrated, and this new integrated state, or integral state as he called it, um, took within it civil society and was much better able to have its hand in the controlling of consent, and it was much better able to establish, control, and sustain its rule through consent. And it was able to do this through a whole host of institutions that we kind of talked about this already.
Yeah.
And he said that this was missing in Russia. So the war that the revolutionaries waged in Russia, in the Gramscian language, was more directly a war of maneuver, a sort of
Mhm.
frontal attack, as opposed to the war that has to be waged in the West, which is an ideological war, a
War
counter
position.
hegemonic, a war of position, a counter hegemonic battle. And that's, in a way, you could say that some of that transition is talked about in Foucault's analysis of.
Because the reason why I ask is that Foucault's mentor is Althusser, right? And Althusser's account, right, of the ideological apparatus, right, state apparatus, is sort of based on the distinction between coercion and consent, right? Like Althusser was trying to explain consent. He's trying to explain how you have these like superstructure ideological state apparatuses that help reproduce social relations, right? Um, and how they exert a certain amount of influence on people, right? So that people would continue, so that the next generation would continue this with the production. So I was just wondering if like some of that leaked into like Foucault, right? And Foucault just like developed it without like acknowledging it. That's just
Right.
what was in my
What
mind.
Foucault and his ilk ends up doing as the philosophers of the bourgeois order in the stage of late imperialism or neo-imperialism, um, wherein irrationalism has to frame itself indirectly, like there it has to be what Lukács called an indirect apologetics. Like they have to be critical of capitalism, but find a way that in that critique they can continue to perpetuate it. And they do this through this framework that I'm forgetting the social theorist and the place that I read it from, but it was called you know a radicalism that's tinted with the idea that escape is impossible. And
Right, right.
the maybe I could pull up the precise quote real quick. But
Mhm.
do you have anything else to say? Because I'm gonna look for the quote. I think it's worthwhile
Yeah. No, yeah, yeah, no, it's just like
finding
Herbert
it.
Marcuse is another example of this. But yeah, no, I have we have nothing much else to say. I'll let you find the quote.
Okay. Let's see if I can. Well, I'll look for the quote, I guess, later. Um,
Okay. Hmm.
yeah, I can't. I'm not finding the quote. When I
All right.
say I'm going to find the quote, you're supposed to continue speaking to give me time to
Oh,
find it.
okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Uh, okay. All right.
All right.
So we can go back to watching the lecture.
Yeah, yeah. Let's definitely do that.
A bien fait la critique de tous les rapports de violence politique qui s'exercent dans notre société, on risque de les laisser se reconstituer, même à travers des formes aussi nobles, apparemment aussi pures que celles du syndicalisme anarchiste.
Yes, I would certainly agree with that. Not only
All right. So any thoughts on that? The idea that once we participate in thinking about a new world, because we're bound by the limitations of the one that we're in, we are, I guess, bound again to reproduce and reflect in our discourse the ways of thought of the current order.
The video sort of froze a bit. Like it was acting a little weird, so I didn't catch all of it, though.
Oh, okay. You should have let me know. I would have put it back.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry. My bad.
Qui s'exercent dans notre société, on risque de les laisser se reconstituer, même à travers des formes aussi nobles, apparemment aussi pures que celles du syndicalisme anarchiste.
yes, I would certainly agree.
Okay.
So the
Um,
point is that, by the way, the phrase that I was looking for is the radicalization of the impossibility of exit. Um, and that's essentially what they're doing. They're radicalizing the fact that an escape from capitalism, from the existing order, is impossible. But in doing so, what posits itself as the most radical ends up, in its essence, its substance, being the most really conservative and at times even reactionary. But any ideas on this second point that we just looked at, which is that when you speak about a new world, you threaten to reproduce uh, the world in which you're in.
Is so I'm trying to understand this critique. Maybe I'm a bit slow today, but is this criticism this? If we start a revolution, if we create a new social order, the social order is going to contain um, a lot of the elements from the older order, right? It's going to reproduce a lot of those elements. So maybe what he had in mind was the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union had like a socialist mode of production, but there were a lot of things that happened in the Soviet Union, right? So like the Soviet Union reproduced a lot of the elements, right, of the previous order. So is that something that he had in mind? Was that the intent of his critique?
Right. I'm sure that it's embedded in anti-communism, which is at its
Mhm.
core the rejection of actually existing socialism as not actually different from capitalism. And really, the book that is the most archetypical of that would be, Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man. For whatever good things can come out of that book in specific parts of the analysis, the general idea is that the Soviet Union and the socialist camp in general hasn't really gone beyond the forms of life that exist in capitalism. It's not qualitatively different to capitalism. It's not a post-capitalist society. It's just really a different form of the same highly industrialized society that you find
Yeah,
in capitalism.
yeah, but didn't Marx write in the Critique of the Gotha program that once we have socialism, once we're in like an early stage of socialism, like it's going to have the marks of capitalism, right?
The
Like
birthmark.
the birthmarks.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
that's what we have to critique in these people. It's a purity fetish
right.
what they have, which is that if the next society, or the society that posits itself as socialist, post-capitalist, whatever, if that society is not purely different from what
Mhm.
we've seen before from capitalism, it's then not actually something else. In order for it to be something else, it must have no birthmarks from the previous order,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that is,
yeah, yeah,
philosophically a blunder. It's just
yeah,
horrific
yeah.
because it assumes that change is ever a pure change. And it forgets, a basic law of dialectics, which is observable in nature and history and society and thought and everything, which is that change always preserves something of the old. When you undergo a qualitative change, when you sublate capitalist society and a new society emerges, a socialist society, it's always going to contain something from the old order. It's always going to preserve, it's going to cancel a part of it, and then part of the preservation is going to mean transforming it in some way. But for instance, you have in feudalism, private property, but it's small scale private property. It's individualized. The producers own their tools of production. There's maybe very small indentured servants. There's small what we would call employees now, or wage workers. It's a different relationship, but there's private property. Then with capitalism, you have socialized production, but the private part of accumulation is sustained. The idea then, and this is a very mechanistic way of looking at it, but it's a sort of thought. It's more for pedagogical reasons. The idea then is that socialism sustains that socialized production, but removes the privatized accumulation, and the accumulation would be direct. It would be a socialized form of accumulation. So the idea is that you never find in anything a transformation which doesn't preserve something of the past. So to say that, as Sugar here nicely pointed out, that you have to understand and critique all systems of power before you can change, because only in doing so can the thing that you're changing into be purely different from that in which you're in, is completely absurd. And it's renouncing you to that position of the radicalism of the impossibility of exit, which, in essence, it's why it's conservative, right? Because if you want the next society to be purely different, and change in essence is never going to be purely different from what it's changing out of. What you're in essence saying is that there's going to be nothing else. There's no alternative, and we're back to Thatcher's Tina.
Um, so I was wondering if what Foucault had also had in mind was, so does Foucault really want like a society where there's no punishment, no like discipline, where like people are just free from any punishment and any discipline? Um, because like, I'm sure he's not explicitly arguing from that, right? But I'm wondering if you ask or interrogate Foucault, like what is your ideal society, right? And what would Foucault say? And I'm thinking that Foucault would say something like it's the kind of society where you don't have to like discipline. You don't get disciplined. You don't have to discipline yourself. You have to watch what you're trying to say. Then the reason why I bring this up is because like I think any society, right, even a social society, there's going to be some form of like punishment, right? Especially when you're especially when you're in the world system of imperialism, right? There's always going to be contradictions, right? That you have to deal with, right? You have to use some tools or instruments of coercion and discipline to preserve what was gained, right? Um, yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that's, one of those examples of those things that you're going to just continue to see, and everything that is still a class society, and socialism would still be in some shape of class society, except the difference would be that everyone is in, or the vast majority of people are in control, and the few lingering exploiters from the old order that are plotting and trying to spread their ideas and come back and do counter revolution and
Yeah.
collaborate with imperialism. You need a state to repress those cats, to repress
Yeah,
those people.
and I think like where the purity fetish comes in, at least for Foucault, is oh, see, there's punishment there, there's discipline there. It's not good enough, right? It's like we have to like denounce it. So there's that. I feel like there's that sort of like how progressives would critique other countries, right? They would critique Iran, they would critique China, they would critique all these countries, right, that are victims of imperialism, that are being negatively affected by imperialism. And there's just like I could see how you could easily make a Foucault style critique of these countries, right?
Right, right. Insofar as it sustains even the smallest thing that looks like inform the thing that you have right now under capitalism, therefore it's not actually socialism or whatever.
Right, right,
Um,
right.
but yeah, Sugar's right. People need housing, food, education, healthcare, etc. It's hard to see how Foucault helps his discourse.
Yeah,
He
yeah,
doesn't help it.
yeah. He
It's
does.
actually the opposite. He confuses, and that's why, in part, it's important. What we're doing here, we're removing, hopefully, or playing our part in removing the potential of people who are interested in transformative revolutionary politics, to see any form of ideological leadership in a figure like Foucault, who ultimately, as we're trying to argue, ends up in positions which sound radical but are actually very much conservative, and at times reactionary. So, Cobra Commander, the Western left just wants to end money now. Build socialism is too hard. Yeah, there's actually these anarchists, in the around the city where I go to college, where I teach, that are actually trading in their own currency now. So they did it. Fuck the Soviet Union and China. It's those guys that are ushering in a new world, with their own currency.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
Okay, let's continue with this. We're only 5 minutes in, and we're an hour into our discussion, so we
Yeah.
should maybe try to wrap this up soon. But let's finish the video.
Agree with that, not only in theory, but also in action. That is, there are two intellectual tasks. One, and the one which I was discussing, to try to create the vision of a future just society. Another task is to understand very clearly the nature of power and oppression
want to bring up quick this comment from Zenzovet. Exactly, the USSR was definitely a qualitatively radically different form from the previous order. I know because I lived there. There was some echoes of the past, but they were minor. The USSR changed and improved the quality of life. Absolutely, and that's really been the case with China, Vietnam, Laos, Cuba, the DPRK. Pretty much every country that has embarked on the route of the dictatorship or the proletariat and has been led by a communist party. It's also true in all of the other countries that have emerged since the 20th century and taken a route towards socialism without fully abolishing the old state and creating a dictatorship or the proletariat, or doing it only in parts or in a very gradual manner. But the forms of life are different. And if you look at the interviews that one of the friends of the project, Donald Corder, he's a reporter in Russia, he's done. He did an interview that went viral on YouTube with I think 300,000 views, and it was asking people in the street, old people, what they missed the most about the Soviet Union. And, they said a bunch of things that are related to economic security and stuff like that. But, they said the thing that they missed the most was how people were to each other, the social relations that existed between people. And were there factors that probably looked the same as capitalism? Obviously, because there are going to be. There, you can't expect there not to be, because that's the essence of change. Something from the old is always preserved. But there, it was. If you looked at the essence, the substance of the society, it was qualitatively different from anything that we've seen before in human civilization. Okay, so
Oppression and terror and destruction in our.
oh, sorry, and just Jubika Servas. This gets at the point, right? Alienation, defined by Marx, is treated in a few different ways. In 44, it's a concept that he really ends up developing his whole life. But one of the forms of alienation he talks about in 44 is the alienation that exists between people, not just the alienation of the product and the process of labor and the alienation from the species being and from nature. It's also the alienation that exists when people are just seeing each other as competitive enemies in a market in order to have their labor power be bought and not the one of someone else. That's all eliminated in the Soviet Union and in every other socialist society, where everyone is guaranteed a job, a livable wage, where they see that the surplus of society doesn't go towards the pockets of a small group of rich assholes and parasites that don't work, but that surplus is reinvested in society, in propelling the revolution and lifting the living standard of the people. So, yeah, some aspects of alienation might still exist, but that's because everything's in a constant process, and you can't expect, socialism existing under extremely difficult conditions, under constant imperialist hybrid warfare, existing in a world that's still dominated by capitalist imperialism. You can't expect it to look like the socialism of the 23rd century, as Samir Min, said. Samir Min has this great quote, which is that, the Western Marxists who have never been able to do a revolution in their life expect Chinese socialism to look like 23rd century socialism. And, that's what people that have this purity fetish, that's how they think about socialism. It's this grocery list of things. And if they don't meet all of these standards, if they don't measure up to the pure idea of socialism in my head, I'm going to condemn it. Right. And they do that with the DPRK, with China, with the USSR, with Cuba, with every society that has actually fought against capitalist imperialism and succeeded. And the only societies that they end up loving, the only experiments and struggles that they end up loving, are the ones that failed, because those didn't last enough to be desecrated and to have their purity desecrated. They love the little anarchist experiments that didn't last anything. They love Allende, and I love Allende too, but they love him because he never got to the point of having to desecrate his purity in order to have the revolution survive. They love the people that ended up sooner or later failing fairly quick. But yeah,
Yeah.
let's go back to Mr. Chomsky.
Our own society. And that certainly includes the institutions you mentioned, as well as the central institutions of any industrial society, namely the economic, commercial, and financial institutions, in particular, in the coming period, the great multinational corporations, which are not very far from us physically tonight. Those are the basic institutions of oppression and coercion and autocratic rule that appear to be neutral. After all, they say, well, we're subject to the democracy of the marketplace. Still, I think it would be a great shame to lose or to put aside entirely the somewhat more abstract and philosophical, if you like, task of trying to draw the connections between a concept of human nature that gives full scope to freedom and dignity and creativity and other fundamental human characteristics, and relates that to some notion of social structure in which those properties could be realized, in which meaningful human life could take place. And in fact, if we are thinking of social transformation or social revolution, though it would be absurd, of course, to try to draw out in detail the point that we're hoping to reach, still we should know something about where we think we're going. And such a theory may tell it to us.
Oui, mais alors là, est-ce qu'il n'y a pas un danger? Si on dit...
So there's Chomsky's defense of painting a picture of where we're going. And to be fair, communists, to some extent, we have, there's three different ways that Marxism speaks about communism. There's a very long distant communism, which is, what people usually refer to as communism, which is classless, stateless, moneyless society where interactions are direct. They're unmediated by anything like currency or anything like that. That is one way Marx and Engels speak about communism. Another way is what has been called after Marx and Engels just socialism, which is the dictatorship of the proletariat and transitionary state towards that final ultimate goal. And then another way of speaking about communism is communism as the real movement of history, which abolishes the present state of things, which is, I think, the most immediate form of talking about communism. And it really is perhaps the most dialectical, which says how is the existing state of affairs being abolished and how is history moving forward? And that form of thinking about communism allows you to study different movements and see what is discovered, what new forms are discovered by those movements, which is what Marx and Engels did with the Paris Commune. They didn't say, well, did the Paris Commune measure up to the ideas that I put in the manifesto of the Communist Party or in whatever other texts? No, they studied it. They said, okay, these are people acting in a revolutionary manner, abolishing the existing state of things. Let's see what they have created. What new forms have they discovered? And, so in a way, having a long-term picture, like Chomsky's saying, a place where we're going, it's not all that bad. We Marxists, we have that, but our commitment has to be, in my view at least, to the abolishing of the existing state of affairs, right? Not to measuring the abolishing of the existing state of affairs in accordance with that final picture as a way of judging whether we should support it or not. We should judge it according to whether it's on the route to that, and if it's somewhat deviating, we do comradely critique to hope it gets back on track. But it's but yeah, what are your thoughts?
No, I agree with you. I get the feeling that Chomsky has this very abstract view of human nature as this ideal standard that you use to measure society, rather than understanding human nature dialectically. Human nature is always in motion, right? Because society is in motion, right? Human nature is in flux. It's going to go through a lot of changes. That doesn't mean there's no universal to it. There's a universal collective labor, but the form that it takes is always changes. And obviously, there is a type of human nature that we want. It's the one that involves free association. It's the one that Marx talks about. The one that's about free development, right, for everyone. That's the type of human nature that we want, but the one we have now, right? It's the one under capitalism. It's something that we need to acknowledge, and that we need to figure out how to get ourselves beyond that. I also think that it's really, this might be tangential, but I think there's an interesting parallel between Hegel and Marx. Hegel talks about how in the beginning we start with like pure being, right? God and pure being. But when pure being alienates itself, it goes through this dialectical process where eventually towards the end it enriches itself, right? It enriches itself. And I think human nature I think it's somewhat similar. We start off as hunting gathering societies, right? We start off as primitive communists, right? Using our collective labor to extract something from nature, from animals, from from the soil, right? We extract something and we transform it into social products that we consume, so we could and that we share more or less equally, not strictly equally, but more or less equally, so that we could continue to exist. But then we sort of then somehow alienation happened, right? Private property emerged, and you get slave societies, you got feudalism. But along the way, especially towards when we get towards communism, humanity enriches itself, right? And enriches itself a certain way. So there's this dialectical view of human nature that that seems missing in Chomsky. Chomsky thinks oh, there's this abstract idea of human nature that exists in all of us, and we just have to find the right social structure to realize it. But this is in stark contrast with the Marxist view that's influenced by Hegel, that sees human nature constantly in motion, basically. Yeah.
Absolutely. In the Soviet Union and in the textbooks and stuff, which were helpful, sometimes mechanical, but helpful for people just getting started. It was the idea in order to teach the dialectic and the negation of the negation. The idea was that you start with primitive communism. It's negated by class society over 2,000 or so years, depending on where you're at. Sometimes more, sometimes less. And then that is negated, the negation of the negation, Aufhebung, sublation, by a higher stage of communism. Communism, once the necessities that were experienced in the primitive communism, which were due to an underdevelopment of the forces of production, have been abolished, and you have in this higher stage of communism this abundance that's created because of the development of the productive forces, and that's how the dialectic was proved, or that's the example that they would provide in terms of society and history. And I think that's largely that's largely still correct. But to your point that Chomsky's working with a more static definition, it shows how anarchism really just is a form of old school utopianism. In some places, it goes beyond it, and it's more scientific. But at its core, it ends up being a little bit utopian, because by part of the essence of utopianism, and all of the utopians in the three stages, you have Thomas More, Campanella, and then you have the utopians that Marx and Engels write about the most. Robert Owens, Saint Simon, and Charles Fourier. At its core, the idea is that these guys come up with this idea of a perfect society that's in their heads realizable regardless of the context. Like in Robert Owens's head, he could have been alive 500 years before, and his ideas would have still been correct. The same thing with Fourier and with Saint Simon. So it's this. Although at certain parts they're very good historical thinkers, and it's even dialectical thinkers, it's treated, the movement towards socialism is treated in a very abstract way, such that it could have happened 300 years ago, before the development of the productive forces that's brought about by capitalism. And that seems to be somewhat present in how Chomsky is speaking about his anarcho-syndicalist society.
Right.
Okay, let's.
Il existe une certaine nature humaine, que cette nature humaine n'a pas reçu dans la société actuelle les droits et les possibilités qui lui permettraient de se réaliser. C'est bien ce que vous avez dit, je crois. Et si on admet cela, est-ce qu'on ne risque pas de définir cette nature humaine à la fois idéale et réelle, cette nature humaine cachée et réprimée jusqu'à présent, est-ce qu'on ne risque pas de la définir dans des termes que nous empruntons à notre société, à notre civilisation, à notre culture? Vous-même, en commençant, vous reconnaissiez, je crois qu'on ne savait pas très bien ce que c'était que cette nature humaine. Alors, est-ce qu'elle ne risque pas de nous induire en erreur? Vous savez que Mao Tse-tung parlait de nature humaine bourgeoise et de nature humaine prolétarienne, et il considère que ce n'est pas la même chose.
Well, you see, I think that in
That was I think he might have been past his French Maoist
Yeah.
stage, but that's so funny seeing him and reference Mao. But that's Mao's correct, you know, from the and to some extent Foucault is correct as well. Like your definition and your approach to thinking about the question of human nature is obviously going to be limited and within the scope of the society that itself determines what human nature in that period of time is going to be. Um, so there's something absolutely correct in that, but the problem is that Chomsky is tying the emergence of his anarcho-syndicalist post-capitalist society to his idea of human nature and what would be just in terms of social organization in connection with what his idea of human nature is. Um, and I think that's somewhat worthy of critique. And that's kind of what that's what conservatives do. You know, they say socialism is against human nature, capitalism is the system that best fits human nature, blah blah blah. So Chomsky seems to be doing something in terms of form, at least, not in terms of substance, something similar to what conservatives do.
Right. Yeah. I'm just wondering, like, maybe this is tangential, but Marx talks about how in estranged labor, and to some extent in other early works, like in the Jewish question, Marx talks about how people are alienated from their species being, right? So like what's implicit in there is like that there is some like potential human nature that we fail to realize because of the social order that we're in, right? Is that what Marx tries to convey? And the reason why I'm mentioning this is that maybe like I'm not fully agreeing with Chomsky here, but like maybe there is an aspiration that maybe it's okay for us Marxists to have some kind of aspiration to aim towards, right? Um, and I think Foucault is like saying that there's a danger in having this aspiration, right? Because this aspiration really derives from like the kind of society that we live in. Um, but I kind of understand both perspectives. I kind of understand Foucault's perspective here, but also like um, even though I don't entirely agree with Chomsky, I also think that it's okay to have some aspiration and what kind of human nature we do want to realize in a socialist or in a communist society. Oh, Carlos seems to have disconnected. Let me see if I can contact him. My apologies, everyone. I did not expect Carlos to get disconnected. Let me contact him. Again, everyone, I'm sorry. I'm trying to talk with Carlos here, trying to assess the situation that we're at. So it turns out his internet is disconnected. His internet went out. Uh, so I'm going to see what we can do. Hopefully, we can resume back to our streaming. But if not, it's okay. So yeah, let me see what Carlos is up to. Oh, oh, you're finally back. I'm so sorry. I, you know, I told everyone what happened. Yeah, I didn't know what to do. It's the first time it happened.
Yeah, it's but that was scary being there alone. I haven't done one of these alone, so but yeah, the Wi-Fi went out. Everything seems to be back up now, so
That's good.
we can perhaps finish. Let me see if I can pull up the um, StreamYard on the other laptop that I was doing it in. Uh, if anything, I don't think that there were any lingering important points to be made in the debate. I mean, I watched it earlier this morning, and I think we had already covered pretty
Are
much.
we on, or are we still on
Yeah,
stream?
yeah, we're
Okay.
still live.
Okay. All right.
Um, yeah, I can't seem to pull up the StreamYard on the other laptop I had it going in.
Okay.
So yeah, but any concluding thoughts then on the debate? Who do you think won? Who do you side the most with?
I don't know. I'm actually conflicted. You?
Oh yeah, same. I think there's aspects in each that are compatible with Marxism, and then there's aspects in each that are fully incompatible with Marxism. So I just wish that someone like Michael Parenti could have been
Yeah. Yeah.
the third chair. I think they would have very clearly come out on top of both. And honestly, I think out of the pair, Chomsky's a lot more valuable because he's been an anti-imperialist
Yeah.
speaker
Yeah.
for a very long time. At times, part of the left McCarthyite, left anti-communist, purity fetishist, specifically with the USSR. But with the exception of that, he's been fairly good in his analysis of the media and his analysis of the discourse on U.S. operations in Latin America, in the Middle East, in various parts of the world, in Africa. And currently, he's providing a fairly good analysis of the proxy war against Russia, as opposed to other people that are just,
Yep. Yep.
completely under liberal derangement syndrome, Putin derangement syndrome. But so I would side generally with Chomsky, but both of them are, you know, both of them have their distance from Marxism in terms
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
philosophical worldview. Um,
Yeah.
but as people and as intellectuals, Chomsky is way more redeemable. Foucault, I mean, I read him because I'm an academic, but I would never recommend anyone to read Foucault. Chomsky, I'd recommend Manufacturing Consent,
Yeah. Yeah.
maybe some of his articles, and maybe some of his interviews. But Foucault, I would never do that to someone unless I hate them. Go check out Foucault. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. maybe there's a maybe it's because there's a bit of a liberal in me, but I'm like sympathetic to Chomsky's view of human nature. I obviously don't endorse it, but like I feel like there's something in that view that's redeeming qualities or that's compatible with Marxism, because Marx does talk about us being estranged from our species being, right? Now people often say that, oh, the later Marx does completely reject this view of species being. I don't accept that. Like I read Marx's Capital, where he does talk about how there's something that capitalism is able to do, right? That does realize some aspect, right? That does encourage some aspects of human nature, which is that it socializes production, right? It gets people to work together. It fosters cooperation within the workplace. Now it's done in a way that's still exploitative, right? But still, it fosters this cooperative aspect, right? People do work together. Maybe in some settings, people will work in parallel, but in other settings, people really do work together. And so I don't really accept the view. And then in the group, what's the name of that book? Grundiers or
Andressa. Yeah.
yeah, he quoted Aristotle, didn't he? Right, how human beings are political animals, right?
He quotes Aristotle all the time, but
Oh
yeah,
yeah, yeah,
he definitely accepts that idea in Aristotle. And um, Aristotle also has many other. Aristotle was critical of crematistic circulation. He
mhm,
quotes some of that in Capital. Aristotle, I mean, he starts the metaphysics by saying that all men by nature desire to know, and then a few pages after acknowledges that it is only when the comforts of life are met that one can begin to pursue science and philosophy for its own sake, which is an extremely materialist argument. It's, it could come right out of the German ideology for
Marx in this, yeah. So in the Strange Labor, I agree with you. In the Strange Labor, Marx talks about how free he sort of endorses this view of freedom, where it's free from trying is from physical needs, right? Trying to meet with your physical needs, and it's so the kind of free labor that he endorses is labor that transcends physical needs, right? Mere physical needs, and it's done from just sheer want, right? Um, and yeah, I mean, so yeah. I obviously don't completely agree with Chomsky, but there's this element, right, in his view of human nature that resonates with Marxism, right? And it's this idea that under capitalism, especially under other class societies, but especially under capitalism, like we're alienated from our species being, right? Our species being is, it's free labor, free creative labor of some sort. Um,
I would, I mean, we've interviewed Chomsky. We published an interview with him in the Journal of American Socialist Studies, which everyone can go check out. You can buy yourself a $10 ebook copy, $30
yeah,
paperback copy, because it's very colorful, a lot of pictures inside. Very nice book. But
mhm,
Chomsky is still someone who I think can bring ideological clarity today,
yeah,
regardless of his faults, which should be criticized from, I think, a comradely standpoint. But the moment I think we're in, he is still helpful for a whole lot of people and
yeah,
helping them think in ways that are against the grain.
yeah,
Foucault doesn't do that.
yeah,
Foucault
I
doesn't
agree.
do that. And although I would say, certain texts of Foucault are somewhat helpful, they're helpful for scholars. They
Mhm,
have no place in, like, the readings of a Communist Party member or something, like, or
right,
of any militant, of any socialist militant. You can do without reading Foucault. In the U.S., maybe you could do without reading Chomsky, but it would help if you read Chomsky and if you engage with its stuff, because he's one of the most active speakers, and he's he's a man who's accumulated a whole lot of knowledge in his I believe 95 years of life now, or 97, I'm not sure, but he's getting up
right,
there. And there's still stuff to learn from knowledge and from Chomsky, and he's got good insights on some of the key issues of our day. So I'd recommend Chomsky. I wouldn't recommend Foucault. I don't
right,
know. In terms of the debate, I think philosophically at times Foucault was a whole lot closer to a Marxist position, and that is because of his grounding in Althusser as a student of Althusser. But he takes some of these positions to extremes that end up making the position in his hands go from a genuine dialectical position into a very non-dialectical purity fetish position. So
Right, right. No, I agree. I agree.
this is a good point from Red Horizon. Foucault obscures rather than clarifies the real source of power.
Yep,
Right.
absolutely. Yep, yep.
So, oh, here, Fired Place says, I just bought Carlos's book and started reading it on the company time the other day. That's awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you
yeah,
very
that's
much.
awesome.
I look forward to hearing what you think. I've been surprised by the reaction. It's been overwhelmingly positive. And when you when you write and publish a book where really the object of critique is almost everyone in the space in which you're used to navigating, the left, really, because I attach certain manifestations of the purity fetish to stuff that communists do, and then to stuff that democratic socialists do, and I quite broad in how I see this worldview of the purity fetish manifesting itself in various ways in the left. So I was expecting it to get a lot of hate, and to there were quite a few people to feel like ideologically they were the object of critique, and hopefully overcome that and help in overcoming that. But it's been overwhelmingly positive, the critique, the response, and I've really
Congratulations, by the
appreciated that.
way.
Thank you.
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
I mean, I wrote it for the purpose of it being a quick read, maybe one or two sittings, and you can get through it, and hopefully it helps to bring ideological clarity. If Marxism is worth anything, at least it's worth uh, the ability to give us, unlike any other worldview, some sense of clarity in very, very troubling and confusing times. And that's part of what I'm trying to do in that book, because I think clarity and overcoming these flaws of outlook are fundamental for moving forward, and we desperately need to move forward and build a
Absolutely. Oh, Carlos, you there? Hopefully he didn't disconnect again. Mm. Yeah, sorry, everyone. It seems like Carlos's screen is frozen. Um, Hopefully his internet didn't. Oh, it went out. Yeah, his internet went out again. Oh boy. Um, Again, apologize everyone. I wish this didn't happen. Let me try to contact him. Okay, so I contacted Carlos, and yeah, he seems to be he's disconnected. He just wants to say thank you for participating in the stream. Your contribution and participation in the stream are extremely valuable. And I would also like to thank you um, and for participating and contributing to the stream. I hope you all enjoy it. I guess this means that this is the end of the live stream. And yeah, I strongly recommend all of you, to anyone who's currently watching who's going to watch later, to buy Carlos's book on the purity fetish. I would also like to strongly encourage everyone to donate if you can.
I'm back.
Oh, he's back! He's back! Finally!
Oh man, this
Oh
connection
boy!
sucks. But thankfully, I'll be moving, so hopefully, I'll have better Wi-Fi wherever the hell I go. But
Yeah,
thank
yeah.
you all for watching. Thank you, Paul, for joining me. I haven't, I'm very glad I had some company in this stream, and thank you all for sticking around despite my my horrible Wi-Fi. Yes, Paul was killing it. All right, folks. Well, thanks again for sticking around. It's especially late over here. It's 1:00, 1:10 where I'm at, East Coast. So thank you all, and we'll see you next time.